Before they became icons of history, they were simply young men and women, students, soldiers, daughters, sons. These rare photographs take us back to the early years of the world's most famous leaders, when the weight of history had not yet found them. London, 1940. 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth pauses with a book in hand. In the shadow of war, the future queen was still just a schoolgirl, caught between childhood and duty. South Pacific, 1943. A young John F. Kennedy stands in a rumpled naval shirt and cap, a walking stick in hand. Behind the easy smile is a man still recovering from war wounds, not yet the president, but a lieutenant who had narrowly survived the sinking of his patrol boat. In the 1970s, a young Diana Spencer walks to boarding school. She would later call those years a sad time, long before the world knew her as the Princess of Wales. Los Angeles, 1980. A freshman named Barry Obama leans back for a quiet portrait at Occidental College. Long before the White House, he was just another student, thoughtful and still finding his way. In 1895, a young Winston Churchill stands in uniform as a second lieutenant of the Hussars. Long before the war speeches and history books, he was just a restless officer chasing adventure. At Harvard in the early 1900s, Franklin Roosevelt was just another student in a dark suit and tie. Few could imagine this confident young man would one day guide America through depression and war. Cambridge, 1877. Theodore Roosevelt, thin and sharp-eyed at Harvard, still years away from the Rough Riders or the White House. A frail student then who would grow into America's fiercest president. Illinois, 1858. Abraham Lincoln sits for a rare portrait, lean and unknown beyond his state. Just 2 years later, this quiet lawyer would rise to the presidency. New York, 1964. Donald Trump in his military academy uniform, long before real estate and politics made his name a fixture in American life. Oujda, Morocco, March 1962. Nelson Mandela trains with Algerian fighters, preparing for a struggle that would one day make him the face of freedom. India, 1876. A 7-year-old Mohandas Gandhi stares into the camera, the only photograph of him as a child, long before the world would know him as Mahatma. England, the 1890s. 15-year-old Jawaharlal Nehru at Harrow, still a schoolboy abroad, decades before leading India into independence. A young Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later called Ataturk, stands in full dress uniform, medals from the Balkan Wars on his chest, years before he would remake Turkey into a new nation. Helwan, Egypt. A young Gamal Abdel Nasser at boarding school, long before the revolution and the dream of Arab nationalism carried his name across the world. Georgia, 1902. A young Joseph Stalin poses for a portrait, sharp-eyed and restless. Few then could imagine this quiet revolutionary would one day rule with iron and fear. Samara, 1891. A young Vladimir Lenin, freshly trained in law, sits for a portrait. No hint yet that this quiet student would one day ignite a revolution. France, 1914. Adolf Hitler poses as a lance corporal with his Bavarian regiment. Just another soldier in the trenches, years before the world would know his name in terror. France, 1945. General Charles de Gaulle stands tall in uniform. The war just ended. Soon, this soldier of free France would become the president of a nation reborn. Russia, the 1950s. A young Mikhail Gorbachev smiles for the camera, decades before he would rise to lead the Soviet Union through its final years. Changsha, 1919. A young Mao Zedong, just 25, stares with quiet intensity, still a student and librarian's assistant years before leading China's revolution. Marseille, 1921. A young Ho Chi Minh, then known as Nguyen Ai Quoc, sits among delegates at the French Communist Congress, a quiet face in the crowd, years before leading Vietnam's fight for independence. Jilin, 1927. A teenage Kim Il-sung during his student days in northeast China, long before he became the founding leader of North Korea. China, 1920. Chiang Kai-shek, still a rising officer, stands at the dawn of his military career, decades before leading a divided nation through war and exile. Singapore, the 1920s. A young Lee Kuan Yew, hands folded across his chest, his gaze somber, a quiet boy who would one day transform a small island into a global nation. Ethiopia, the early 1900s. A young Haile Selassie, future emperor and symbol of African independence, grounded in faith and tradition. Ghana, the 1940s. A young Kwame Nkrumah, determined and unshaken, the man who would lead his nation to become the first in Africa to win independence. Brussels, January 1960. Patrice Lumumba, fierce and unyielding, speaks as the voice of a Congo on the edge of independence. In the 1980s, a young Vladimir Putin stands in the uniform of the KGB. Before politics, before the Kremlin, he lived in the shadows of Soviet intelligence. In the mid-1970s, 21-year-old Angela Kasner smiles beside her soon-to-be husband, Ulrich Merkel. Long before politics, she was simply a young student finding her way. As a teenager in the 1990s, Emmanuel Macron was just another student in provincial France, long before the world knew him as president. In 1973, 2-year-old Justin Trudeau stole the spotlight when he spoke his first words to the press, a child already growing up in the glare of public life. In 1951, a young Prince Charles sits with his grandfather, King George VI, a quiet family moment at the heart of Britain's royal legacy. In 1969, young Hillary Rodham stood at Wellesley College, speaking on student protests. It was the first glimpse of a voice that would one day echo in American politics. In 1951, a young Margaret Roberts stood as the Conservative candidate for Dartford, long before the world would know her as Britain's first woman Prime Minister. In 1893, a young Joseph Stalin posed for this portrait in Georgia. Long before the Kremlin, long before the Terror, he was just another student with a distant gaze. At the turn of the century, a young Adolf Hitler sat quietly on a sofa in Austria, an ordinary child, before the world knew the devastation his name would carry. In the early 1900s, a young Benito Mussolini posed as a socialist journalist. Few could imagine he would later lead Italy into dictatorship and war. In 1935, Hideki Tojo appeared in uniform as a rising officer. Within a decade, he would lead Japan through its darkest war years. Around 1910, Crown Prince Hirohito sat for this portrait. Years later, as emperor, his name would be forever tied to the Second World War. In the 1920s, Francisco Franco stood in uniform as a young officer. He would go on to rule Spain for nearly 4 decades under dictatorship. In the 1950s, Saloth Sar, later known as Pol Pot, studied in Paris. Behind the smile was a man who would lead one of the 20th century's darkest regimes.